Assalamu alaikum. This is the fourth lecture of Pakistan Studies. The topic is Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and the Aligarh Movement, second part. We began the discussion of this topic in the lecture number 3, and this lecture will be an extension of what we discussed in the third lecture. Now, before we deal with the new material for this lecture, it is important that we recap what we discussed in lecture 3. Let me give you a very brief summary so that today's discussion is in its proper context. In lecture number 3, first we discussed background, पस मंजर, यानी वो क्या हालात थे जिनमें सर सैयद अहमद खान और उनके साथियों ने अपना काम शुरू किया. वो बहुत मुश्किल और पुराशोभ हालात थे. Second, efforts to promote understanding between the British and the Muslim, यानी वो कोशिशें जो इन हजरात ने की मुसलमानों और ब्रिटिश के दरमियान जो शकूक व शुबहात थे उनको दूर करने के लिए. इस सिलसिले में सर सैयद की बहुत सी तहरीरों का तज़किरा किया गया. 3, efforts to promote Western knowledge and English language. इस सिलसिले में हमने सर सैयद अहमद खान और उनके साथियों की उन कोशिशों का तज़किरा किया जिसके ज़रिए उन्होंने मगरिबी अलूम को उर्दू ज़बान में मुंतकिल करने की कोशिश की और मुसलमानों में फैलाया और मुसलमानों को तरगीब दी कि वो अंग्रेज़ी ज़ुबान सीखें. 4th, the educational movement. वो क्या कोशिशें थीं जो सर सैयद अहमद खान ने यहाँ पे की ताकि इस मुल्क में मुसलमानों में जो है वो मगरबी तालीम फैलाई जाए और मुसलमान जो हैं इल्म की दौलत से माला माल हो जाएं. Now, let's identify the topics that we are going to discuss today, that is in lecture number 4. First, we'll discuss the contribution and significance of the Aligarh movement. Second, we'll discuss Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's advice to the Muslims to avoid active politics. In this connection, we will be discussing number of things. 1, Urdu-Hindi controversy, then formation of the Congress Party in 1885. 3, the Hindu extremist movements. 3, we'll discuss the use of the term nation by Sir Syed for the Muslims of this region. 4th, we will talk about other educational movements that developed in different parts of India and that also contributed to spreading education and new awareness amongst the Muslims of this region. Now let's take up the first item, that is contribution of the Aligarh movement to the revival and regeneration of the Muslims. Aligarh developed as the most important center of intellectual development for the Muslims of South Asia. and its students, those who studied in the Aligarh College, came from all over India, from different parts of India. There were students coming from Punjab and frontier, students coming from Bengal, and also from South India. In a way, it had become a kind of a focal point for Muslims of South Asia for their education. In addition to this, there was a lot of intellectual activity going on, and that is what we have discussed. For example, publication of different magazines, activities of scientific society, and through these kind of activity there was a lot of intellectual stimulation which was provided by the Aligarh movement. Then this educational movement created students who combined two different traditions. These students learned modern knowledge, English language, modern Western philosophy, but they also acquired Islamic knowledge, diniyat. And this was a significant feature of Aligarh College or Aligarh education system, that while giving modern education to these students, they should not be de-linked from their roots. And if you de-link them from their roots, they become rootless. And that is what Aligarh movement was trying to avoid, in order to deal with the criticism that Western education would alienate our young people from Islam, its teachings and principles. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and his colleagues proved that modern education and Islamic education can be brought together. The third major contribution of the Aligarh movement was that it brought forward a group of Muslims who were educated, who were very conscious of what was happening in India and outside India. This educated class that developed in India was instrumental in promoting Muslim identity and also advocating Muslim demands to the government and to others. Because on the one hand, this educated class could communicate with the rulers, that is the British, because they knew the language, they knew modern knowledge, philosophy, and the thinking that had developed there. So they could communicate with the rulers. On the other hand, they held their roots in the culture. Therefore, they could also communicate with the ordinary people for mobilizing ordinary people, for making them conscious of what makes them different from others. Another important contribution of this movement was that this inspired educational movements elsewhere in India. Towards the end of lecture, we will talk about some other movements that were also promoting the objectives which were important and dear to the Aligarh movement. And the last major contribution of the Aligarh movement was that the Muhammadan Educational Conference that was created by these Muslim leaders had become a kind of a forum where Muslims from different parts of India would come together and they would discuss not only education but all those issues which were of great concern to Muslims. And since the meetings of Muhammadan Educational Conference were being held in different places, in different cities, it was able to communicate the message of the Aligarh movement all over India. It also brought together like-minded Muslims to pursue the goals and ideals of promotion of education and improvement of Muslims all over India. We can say that the Aligarh movement played a pivotal role in regenerating the Muslims who were facing a serious psychological depression and economic setback after 1857. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and his colleagues advised Muslims to avoid active politics. He was of the opinion that at that stage, Muslims should not get involved in active politics. He was not inherently opposed to politics. The point he was presenting was that at that stage, and given the conditions and problems of the Muslims of that time, they should stay away from active politics and concentrate on education. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan used to say that at that time, Muslims needed education, education, and education. If we look at the facts and data that is available about the education of Muslims and others in India, we can understand why Sir Syed was so particular about education. And I give you an example. From 1859 to 1875, only 20 Muslims were able to get graduation degree from the educational institutions which the British colonial administration had set up in India. Against this, during the same period, 715 Hindus got education and got the graduation degree. So you could compare the figure 20 against 715. The concern at that time was that if they get involved in active politics and they don't pay attention to acquiring modern education, they will be left behind. And the gap between the Muslims and others will widen. And ultimately, the Muslims would suffer. He wanted that over a period of time, there should be a group of Muslims who have modern education and who could fit into the modern system which the British had introduced, the modern state system, the administration which was set up by the British. And you could fit into this, that is, you could get jobs, you could interact with this administration only if you were equipped with modern education. And Sir Syed thought that if Muslims have education, then they will become relevant to the changed conditions and they will be able to meet with the challenges of time. There was another reason why he was emphasizing education that much. He thought that if Muslims get too much involved in active politics, then the perception that Muslims are against the British will be reinforced. And the misunderstandings that had developed between the Muslims and the British would increase. But if they have education, they get the requisite qualification, then that misunderstanding will be removed and they will be the people who could be playing important role under the British. A number of other developments during the same period influenced the advice which Sir Syed and his colleagues were giving, that is, advice to acquire modern knowledge, acquire to have modern education, acquire capability to deal with the changed conditions. One such incident is described as Hindi-Urdu controversy. In brief, this was a kind of movement started in 1867 in city of Banaras by Hindus for replacing Urdu with Hindi written in Devanagari script. If you look at the background of Urdu, you find that this language developed during the Muslim rule in India, and it derived from Arabic, Persian, and local Indian languages that were prevalent at that time. And this was the language which the soldiers began to speak. But over time, this became a popular language, a language at the common man level. Although non-Muslims also spoke and used this language, but somehow it got associated with Muslim cultural heritage and Muslim identity. Now, when the British established themselves in India, they changed the official language of India in 1837 from Persian to English. But at the lower level, in many states, Urdu was being used. In 1867, a number of Hindus started a movement that Urdu should not be used in courts at the lower level or in administration at the lower level. Instead, Hindi should be used, which is written in Devanagari script. Now, this movement was a kind of a shock for Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and his colleagues, who were working for the welfare and betterment of all people. But here they realized that the Muslims and their heritage is being targeted. So an organization, Urdu Defense Society, was set up in 1873. The objective of Urdu Defense Society was to advocate that Urdu should not be replaced. Urdu should be continued to be used because it is a language which is widely understood, widely spoken at the ordinary person level. To these people, the movement was something that was undermining and spoiling the atmosphere. And Sir Sayyid and his colleagues were very much disappointed by this development. Another important development of that period was the establishment of the Congress Party. Congress Party was established in 1885. It was set up by a group of Indians who were educated, Western educated, and they thought that they must have a forum of their own to present their demands to the British government and also to bring diverse Muslims together. The interesting thing about the establishment of the Congress in 1885 is that the British played a significant role. In fact, a number of retired British civil servants were associated with the Congress. The founder of Congress was A.O. Hume, a retired civil servant, a British in nationality, but a retired civil servant who served in India. He brought together other educated Indians who set up this organization. The Congress Party claimed to represent all Indians. It had Muslims in it. Some of its president were Muslims, but Muslim representation was all the time very limited. And with the passage of time, Muslim membership in the Congress in the early years declined. The reason was that Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan and other Muslim leaders advocated that Muslims should stay away from Congress. They should not get actively involved with the Congress Party. One major argument which they were giving was the one we have already discussed. That is, advice to Muslims to avoid active politics. The second reason which was advocated at that time was that the kind of program the Congress was advocating did not protect Muslim interest. Two of the demands which the Congress made were described to be adversely affecting Muslim interest. One demand was recruitment to civil services through competitive exams. The Muslim point of view at that time was that such a system can function successfully where education is widely spread and different groups, different classes have education. If you have educated people, perhaps there can be competition. But in a situation where Muslims do not have that much education, this would work against the interest of the Muslims. The second principle that was advocated at that time was the elective principle. That is, Indians should be elected to different institutions which the British were setting up. Sir Syed and his colleagues maintained that this elective principle did not help or did not serve the Muslims. This did not serve the Muslim because pure and simple democratic system did not take into account the ground realities prevailing in India, the differences between Muslims and others. It did not take into account. And any democratic system must be built keeping in view the ground reality. So he was not opposed to democratic or elective system, but he wanted that this should be introduced with due consideration to the conditions in India. In order to present this point of view, the Muslims established Indian Patriotic Association at Aligarh. The objective was to show to the British that all Indians are not part of the Congress. Congress does not represent each and every segment of Indian society. The second objective was to create a forum for those who were not part of Congress or who did not want to be part of Congress. Third, to present the demands to the British government to encourage Muslims to avoid agitational politics so that they can concentrate on education. Now, in addition to this, the third major development that affected the Muslims at that time was the emergence of Hindu revivalist or extremist movements. A number of Hindu revivalist movements came into existence in the last quarter of the 19th century, especially during the last decade of the 19th century. The primary focus of these movements, that is Hindu revivalist movement, was revival of Hinduism, revival of the purity of the days of Vedas, and to purify Hinduism from the corrupting influences that had developed, which means the British and the Islamic influences. But at the operational level, these movements became anti-Muslim. they were targeting Muslims more than the British. I may give you a few examples of these movements just to give you an idea. The Arya Samaj movement was set up in 1877. It was a revival, Hindu revival movement. Then you can also look at the role of a Hindu leader, B.G. Tilak, who was pursuing these objectives in a very aggressive manner. Then we can talk about cow protection movement that was launched. Different associations were set up for this kind of demand. Then you also had Shevaji Tahriks or movements set up during that period. As I said earlier, that Muslims became more target of these efforts. The reason was that the British were rulers, so they could not so easily be targeted by these movements. Whereas Muslims were living in the same society, at the same level, in the cities, in the villages, all over India. Therefore, they could be targeted. And they did suffer. There were a lot of communal riots during these years. And this development, that is extremist, Hindu extremist movements, also transformed the thinking of the Muslims. And in 1903, Muslims established an organization called Muhammadan's Political Association, basically to protect and promote their interest, given the kind of scenario I have presented to you. It is in this context that we can talk about another important development, which is important topic for today's discussion, that is the use of the term nation for Muslims by Sir Sayyid. If you look at the contribution of Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan and his colleagues, initially he was working for the welfare and betterment of all Indians, Muslims in particular, others also in general. However, the incidents I have narrated to you, like revivalist, Hindu revivalist movement, Hindi-Urdu controversy, and similar developments led to a change in Sir Sayyid's thinking. Gradually, he came to the conclusion that Muslims and others may not be able to work together harmoniously with shared objectives. You know, at one time, Sir Sayyid said that Hindus and Muslims are two eyes of a bride, that is India. However, after all that experience we have discussed, his attitude changes and he talks about Muslims as a nation, as an entity that will work differently and separately from others. So in a way, the term Muslims began to be used by Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, and subsequently in the 20th century this became a kind of the general concept that was used for Muslims of South Asia. Now we have talked about Aligarh movement, its contribution to state and society at that time. We have also discussed how the attitude of the Muslim leaders changed towards the political issues. That is why they advised Muslims to stay away from active politics and concentrate on education. Now, in addition to the Aligarh movement, in addition to Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and his colleagues, there were some other movements for spreading education amongst the Muslims, movements for preparing Muslims to deal with the changed or different situation. One important movement was Darul Uloom Deoband. Deoband at that time was a village, a small village in Uttar Pradesh, that is Indian state of Uttar Pradesh. And in 1867, some religious scholars established an Islamic school in a mosque in Deoband, a village at that time. Nobody knew at that time in 1867 that this small school attached with a mosque in a rather unknown village would ultimately become an important center of learning in India. And that is what happened. With the passage of time, this grew into an independent institution and ultimately got the status of Darul Uloom. This institution was set up by Islamic religious scholars. It was kind of a response to the establishment of British rule and the degeneration and decay of the Muslims. These scholars thought that by going back to Islam, they would be able to revive the glory of Muslims and regenerate them. In fact, with the passage of time, this school became a center of Islamic scholarship in India and Pakistan, described as Deobandi tradition. Its old students established similar religious schools all over India and Pakistan. In the political domain, these scholars were divided between Congress and the Muslim League. Some of these scholars were influenced by Congress philosophy and supported Congress party. There were a number of Islamic scholars associated with this school who supported the cause of Pakistan, who worked for Pakistan. I can give you one or two examples. For example, Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi, Mahmood al-Hassan, Maulana Shabir Ahmad Usmani. These were the people who worked for Pakistan and supported the establishment of Pakistan. Another important institution that developed during that time was Nadwatul Ulama Lucknow. This was also an institution set up by Islamic scholars in order to regenerate Muslims through Islamic and religious education. This school also produced a number of eminent Islamic scholars, who had profound influence and impact on Muslim thinking in this subcontinent. In addition to these two institutions, there were several other institutions and organizations which were influenced by the thinking and philosophy of the Aligarh movement. One such movement was Anjuman-e Hamayat-e-Islam, that was set up in Lahore. And with the passage of time, this organization established schools and colleges where Muslims got education. It established a series of Islamiyah schools and Islamiyah colleges. Some of these colleges are still functioning in Pakistan. In 1972, these institutions, which were with the Anjuman-e Hamayat-e-Islam, were taken over by the government under its nationalization policy. However, these schools played very important role in developing Muslim consciousness. And that was the objective of Anjuman-e Hamayat-e-Islam when it was established in the last century. The objective was to safeguard Islamic values. Second objective was to counter the role of the Christian missionaries that were working all over India, and Anjuman wanted to counter that. The other objective was to promote education, to promote Islamic values, and to do the upbringing of the young people on modern as well as Islamic lines. Therefore, Anjuman-e Hamayat-e-Islam played a very significant role in development of the new generation of educated Muslims. In fact, if you go to the period, that is couple of years before independence, that is, if you go to the 40s, especially 45, 1946 and 47, during these years, the students as well as the old students of Aligarh, that is MAO College, which had become a university by that time, so the old boys of Aligarh and those who were studying in Aligarh at that time, as well as the students of different Islamiyah colleges, were very active in taking the message of the Qaid-e-Azam and the Muslim League to far and remote areas of India, especially in Punjab. In fact, they have played very important role. That is, the students of Aligarh and Islamiyah colleges, they played very important role in the success of the Muslim League in the 1946 elections, which the Muslim League contested, and succeeded in capturing most of the Muslim seats, and these students played very important role. In addition to these two institutions, there are several other institutions, but I will mention just two in order to give you some more examples of the point that I am making. Sindh Madrasa in Karachi was another important center of learning for Muslims. Sindh Madrasa in Karachi also followed the tradition that developed at Aligarh. It combined modern education with Islamic education. It tried to produce people who knew both, that is modern education as well as the Islamic identity. Then I can also mention Islamiyah College Peshawar, another important institution whose products, that is old students, were very active in the Pakistan movement. And in fact, Islamiyah College Peshawar has played very important role in spreading education amongst the Muslims of the Northwest Frontier Province. So in this way, we could say that Aligarh movement plus other institutions, some were set up by the religious scholars and some were influenced by the Aligarh movement, were the institution that in fact transformed the Muslim community and enabled them to meet the challenges of the time. Let me wind up today's lecture. Today, I was extending the discussion on Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and his colleagues that began in lecture number 3. And I described what kind of contribution Aligarh had made to the revival of the Muslims of British India, and what kind of advice Sir Syed Ahmad Khan gave, and what were the political circumstances and conditions that changed their outlook and convinced these leaders that first Muslims should have education and then they should organize themselves on forums and present their demands in a logical manner, in a more systematic and organized manner, so that their point of view is presented effectively without getting involved in agitational politics and similar problems. Dear students, this brings to an end what we were discussing. Khuda Hafiz, until we meet again.